Today's video is another compilation of some of the worst mountaineering tragedies we have covered on this channel, from terrifying survival stories to high altitude rescues to unclimbable 8,000 meter mountain faces. We cover it all. I appreciate you all for taking the time to watch my marathon videos, but if you want to see each individual story as they are uploaded, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. It's the evening of December 20th, 1987. The red afterglow of sunset is slowly fading into the dark, cold emptiness of the night on the snow-covered surface of Annapurna. The wind howls through the jagged rocks, biting into the icy air as shadows stretch across the towering, dangerous slopes. At a bone-chilling height of 7,500 meters, Japanese mountaineer Yoshihiro Sato is clinging to the ropes with his body frozen against the steep cliff face. Below him, the heart-stopping drop seems endless, waiting to swallow him whole. He's the last man from his four-person team, which had just conquered the deadly south face of the most dangerous mountain on Earth a few hours ago. Sitting at a height of 8,091 meters, 32% of people don't return from climbing Annapurna, and its south face poses an even more fatal risk. Yoshihiro knows this all too well. Just a few hundred meters above, he witnessed one of his climbing partners slip into the mountain's cold grasp. The rest of the group have already returned to their camp, leaving him alone, pushing forward with a single thought in his mind: would he make it back to his team? It's the onset of the deadly winter season, and he is not even carrying any oxygen cylinders. Every breath he takes feels like a battle against the mountain itself. But then, cutting through the quiet of the night, he hears it. A faint call from below. It's his teammates. They are waiting for him at their camp. He can hear them now, which means they are very close, perhaps even less than 100 meters. For a brief moment, the weight of the mountain, the pain of his loss, the biting cold, all of it melts away. He shouts back with his voice filled with a spark of hope, telling them he's on his way. Back at the camp, his team members hear him. Their hearts are heavy with a bittersweet mixture of emotions. They sit waiting, expecting him to appear at any moment. But in that crushing isolation of the mountain, none of them could possibly imagine the heartbreaking truth. Yoshihiro Sato would never make it back to his team. This is his story. The ancient Hindu and Tibetan civilizations, living across the rugged terrains of today's Nepal and northern regions of India, used to worship the towering, out-of-sight, unreachable mountains as their gods. Mount Kailash, for example, was worshipped as the home of Lord Shiva, and the highest peak on the planet, Mount Everest, was seen as the goddess mother of Earth, or goddess of sky in different cultures and beliefs, with some of them still intact in the local nearby tribes. The goddess of food or harvest was the title given to what we know today as Annapurna. However, ironically, while people used to see the mountain as a sort of life giver, the stats today tell a completely different story. For every 3 people who try to summit Annapurna, 1 doesn't make it back alive, and it's not hard to see why. The mountain's steep, unpredictable routes and wild weather shifts make it insanely dangerous. Climbers often say that trying to summit Annapurna isn't just about reaching the top, it's about staying alive long enough to get there. And that's before you even consider all the usual risks that come with climbing any one of the 8,000ers. Out of all 14, Annapurna 1 was the first 8,000 meter peak to be conquered back in 1950. The climb, though grueling, was done using the north face, which interestingly enough was considered the relatively safer route, though it still proved to be anything but safe. The climbing partners, Maurice Herzog and Louis Lachenel, lost their fingers and toes to severe frostbite and barely made it back after facing multiple life-threatening situations. The whole expedition was a nail-biting, near-miraculous feat that somehow didn't end in disaster. Fast forward 2 decades to 1970, when the British climbers became the first to summit Annapurna using the south face, which is the mountain's most lethal side. That's because an infamous 3,000 meter steep ice wall climbs almost all the way to the summit, making the route even more dangerous, especially considering Annapurna's already fatal reputation. On May 27, 1970, British mountaineers Don Willens and Dougal Haston reached the summit. But since it was during the summer climbing season, the challenge of summiting Annapurna in winter was still waiting for someone to claim. 17 years later, in 1987, 2 Polish climbers, Jerzy Kukuczka and Arthur Hager, made the first winter ascent of Annapurna without supplemental oxygen. However, realizing just how dangerous their mission already was, they took the safer route up the northern side instead of the south face. But it wasn't long before other mountaineers started eyeing that record too. The Japanese climbers from the Gunma Mountaineering Association had already tried their hand at it 2 years earlier, in 1985. They got as far as 7,200 meters, but had to turn back due to heavy, unpredictable snowfalls typical of Himalayan winters. The GMA team, however, didn't give up. They left the mountain with a renewed determination to tackle the challenge again with more experience and better resources. Soon after, 8 members of the GMA joined an expedition to Everest to learn deeply about the harsh Himalayan conditions. The trip went just as expected, and armed with all the knowledge they gained, the core team recruited 14 members for a new expedition to Annapurna's south face, including all 8 members from the Everest team, who had collectively summited various 8,000-meter peaks for a total of 17 times. So in terms of experience, this was by far the most prepared expedition to Annapurna up until that point. But the risk was still something that couldn't be taken lightly. Apart from the climb itself, the biggest concern was the weather. The team hoped to set up their final camp before making their summit push in early December. However, by the end of the month, one of the season's worst snowfalls was expected. This meant that if the expedition ran late, not only might their summit attempt be delayed, but the entire mission could go horribly wrong. The obvious fix would have been to reschedule to a different time. However, moving it earlier would disqualify the climb as a true winter ascent, since the official Himalayan winter season runs from late December to February. Their planned time frame of early December was already pushing that limit. Delaying until January or later wasn't a solid option either, as conditions would only worsen, so the first 2 weeks of December were their only shot. This implied they have to travel from base camp to the summit in just 15 days, a task that would be almost impossible for a regular expedition. On paper, they thought they could make it work by streamlining their approach. They decided to cut the number of camps from the 7 used by the British expedition in 1970 down to just 5. This would mean less equipment and fewer supplies to haul, making things lighter for the climbers and porters, helping them move faster. They also planned to move the base camp closer to the mountain's south face, making everything efficient from logistics to the climb itself, ultimately cutting down on time spent in the more exposed areas of the mountain. But there was still a major loophole in this entire plan. When climbing a mountain, one of the most important survival factors is acclimatization. This usually means spending anywhere from a few hours to several days at various camps, depending on how high you are. The process of climbing and acclimatizing go hand in hand as climbers work their way up. In their condition, trying to rush to the summit in just 15 days wouldn't leave much time for this crucial step, which would put their safety on the line. And given how harsh Annapurna's terrain was, attempting it like that would basically be signing up for a suicide mission. After a lot of thinking and hitting a few dead ends, the team finally came up with a smart solution. Instead of trying to cram everything into one go, they decided to split the process. They figured they could focus on acclimatizing beforehand and then attempt the summit later. Nearby in the same Himalayan region were 2 relatively safer zones, Tent Peak and Glacier Dome. Tent Peak at 5,663 meters is a popular trekking peak in the Annapurna region, while Glacier Dome, standing at 7,200 meters, has a rounded summit. Both were less technically challenging than Annapurna, and the glaciers and snowfields were very similar to what they'd face on the main peak. The team decided to use these locations as training grounds, acclimatizing there in the last few days of November, preparing their bodies for the high altitude grind. Once December rolled around, 6 signaling the start of the Himalayan winter season, they'd launch their summit push, bypassing the typical on-the-go acclimatization process. This would allow them to complete the climb within their 2-week deadline, technically achieving a winter ascent, while finishing before the worst of the bad weather would arrive. By November 22, 1987, the climbers from the Gunma Mountaineering Association had set up a new base camp right at the foot of Annapurna's imposing south face wall at 4,300 meters. This was about 600 meters higher than the standard base camp used by previous expeditions, giving them a head start on the climb and shaving off some precious time. For the next week, the organizing team and support staff dove headfirst into planning and mapping out their route up the mountain. Meanwhile, all 11 climbers were busy with intense acclimatization drills. They tackled the 5,663 meters of Tent Peak for a total of 27 times. These repeated ascents allowed their bodies to adapt to the altitude and thin air, while also testing their physical limits. On Glacier Dome, they aimed to reach 7,000 meters, but only managed to get up to 6,000 meters in the limited time they had. Even so, it was enough to give them valuable insight into the mountain's conditions. The final days before the climb were spent resting and fine-tuning their preparations. On December 1st, with all high spirits and plenty of confidence, the team began their ascent of Annapurna's south face. Thanks to the week of thorough planning, they successfully reached the location for Camp 1 the same day, setting it up at 5,300 meters. That first night was spent settling in, and by the next morning, they were hard at work preparing the route to Camp 2. Since this path followed a previously established Trail 2, progress was even faster. By December 3rd, the support staff had carried all the essential climbing gear to the Camp 2 site, and it was set up at 6,100 meters. While the plan was to finish the climb within 15 days, the team had prepared for the worst by bringing extra food and supplies to survive at least 2.5 months in case of emergencies. Most of this additional gear was stored at base camp in Camp 1, while only the essentials were carried by porters to higher camps. So far, everything seemed to be falling into place, almost too smoothly, but it wouldn't be long before the mountain started to show its true, unforgiving nature. The same day they set up Camp 2, a massive hanging glacier from the upper south face collapsed, triggering a deadly avalanche that came barreling towards Camp 1. While the camp wasn't directly in its path, it still took a heavy hit. In an instant, nearly 90% of their equipment, food, and rescue gear was swept away. The support staff barely managed to escape with their lives, diving under a giant ledge to take cover. The impact was more brutal than anyone had expected, but the team pulled themselves together quickly and began to make do with the remaining resources from base camp. Yet the weather just kept getting worse. 3 days later, they managed to climb 750 meters and reached the location for Camp 3 at 6,850 meters, all while ice rocks were raining down on the entire south face. The next morning, one of the team members who had been helping with route selection was struck on the leg by one of these falling rocks and had to be evacuated to a lower camp to recover. It took 4 more days at the site of Camp 3 to clear the debris and find a safe spot to set up the camp on December 10th, but the very next day, another setback came. A heavy 1-meter snowfall accompanied by extreme winds covered the mountain, halting their progress for the next 72 hours. For a bit of context, a snowfall of 6 to 8 inches within 24 hours is considered dangerous enough to issue a warning in normal residential areas. Here, not only was the snow more than 500% of that, but it was happening on the deadliest mountain in the world, and it wasn't even near the kind of snowstorms they'd been trying to avoid later in December. The Mountaineers spent 3 agonizing days and nights stuck in the snow, unable to move, wondering whether they'd ever reach the top of the mountain, or worse, even survive long enough to make it back down alive. On December 13th, when the situation finally started to ease up, the team realized that the heavy blizzard had actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise. The snow had packed down the unstable rocks on their entire route up the south face, effectively locking them in place. So the constant danger of falling rocks, which had been their biggest threat until then, was no longer a concern. With a renewed sense of hope, the Mountaineers climbed into their tents, packed up, and before long, they were making their way up the route again. They quickly surpassed the 7,200 meter mark, which had been the highest point they'd reached during their failed attempt in 1985. Not long after, they arrived at the base of a massive 100-meter rock face known as the Flat Iron. This was the most critical part of their entire south face route before reaching the summit. But spirits were high, and despite the tough climb, one of the team members took on the Flat Iron. After 4 hours of intense effort, he successfully established a climbing line, allowing the rest of the team to follow. 4 more days of tough trekking later, the 11 climbers along with the support team set up their 4th and final camp at 7,400 meters. By this point, they were already behind schedule due to the snowfall, but it wasn't that bad yet. If the conditions cooperated, they still had a shot at reaching the summit within the next 3 to 4 days and getting back to safety before the bad weather hit. While their instincts were right, the start on Camp 4 didn't go exactly as planned. The camp was set up on a snow ridge, and the fresh snow looked perfect for setting up tents. But when they started digging, they hit a hard layer of ice just beneath the surface. This meant they couldn't properly anchor the tents, and about a third of the tents in Camp 4 weren't secured well enough to withstand the rushing winds. At night, things got far more miserable, and some members of the team had to huddle together for warmth instead of crawling into their sleeping bags, hoping to share whatever body heat they could generate. In those brutal, near inhumane living conditions, the climbing team spent 2 more days fixing the ropes on their route before deciding to make their final push to the summit. They split into 2 groups, each with 6 to 7 members, including a couple of porters to assist both teams. The first team consisted of 4 climbers, 3 of whom were seasoned professionals. Leading the group was the most experienced climber, Nobuo Yamada, alongside his long-term climbing partner, Yasuhiro Sato. This duo made headlines back in December 1985 when they summited Manaslu and brought back the Peace Can, left by the Japanese Alpine Club during their first ascent of Manaslu in 1956. This tobacco canister, often called a message can or peace can, held the names of the summit team members or messages of goodwill, which was a symbolic gesture that resonated deeply with Japanese climbers. The third member was another expert mountaineer, Teru Saingasa, and rounding out the group was the youngest climber, a 22-year-old named Toshiyuki Kobayashi. Kobayashi was a student at Gunma University and had already been part of 2 Everest expeditions by the time he was 19, making it all the way to the South Col. Though he didn't have tons of experience yet, his youth and energy were undeniable. He played a key role in helping set up the ropes on the mountain, earning the respect and trust of the more seasoned climbers in his group. This 4-member team, along with their support staff, set off from Camp 4 at 3:40 a.m. on December 20th, heading into the pitch-black night. The temperatures were still bone-chilling, but surprisingly, the weather was calm with no wind, which was a welcome break from the brutal conditions they faced earlier. After about 5.5 hours of trekking, they finally made it to the mini rock band. It was basically this small, rocky outcrop sticking out from the snow, like a big speed bump on a steep hill. At this point, they were climbing up a slanted snowfield, watching their steps carefully. But once they passed the mini rock band, the next part was way trickier, like a slippery, steep wall of ice, known as the snow face, which eventually led them to a giant ridge. Around noon, they reached a steep section made of sharp rocks and huge ice blocks called the rock face. It was like trying to scale the side of a tall, uneven building, except everything was slippery and covered in snow. This was the hardest part of their climb, requiring ropes, harnesses, and a whole lot of muscle strength. It took them about 2 more hours to get past that section, and by the time they reached the next part, the conditions were still manageable. They figured they could make it to the top in just a couple of hours. From the rock face to the summit, it was about an hour of walking along a narrow ridge with steep, terrifying drops on both sides. One wrong step, and you could be tumbling down for miles, straight into endless snow and jagged rocks. And with no direct sunlight hitting that section, the freezing cold made it all even more intense. Finally, around 3:15 p.m., 4 of them made it to the last stretch of the ridge and stepped onto the summit of Annapurna. They pulled out their cameras to film their achievement, taking in the incredible views that made everything worth it. With excitement running high, they radioed back to base camp, letting the rest of the team know about their success. Months of non-stop preparations, grueling acclimatization drills, long, sleepless nights, battling through exhaustion, and above all, freezing, bone-chilling conditions had all come down to this one life-defining moment. They've done it. They were the first ever climbers to make it to the top of Annapurna's south face in the heart of winter, and they did it without any supplemental oxygen. But of course, as amazing as that felt, they knew the job wasn't entirely done yet. They were already 5 days past their 2-week window, and the weather could turn on them in no time. The next, even bigger challenge was getting back down, a task that would take far more care and caution. While their acclimatization drills on Tent Peak and Glacier Dome had been super helpful so far, it had already been a long, exhausting journey, and now they could feel their energy slipping. They knew it was only a matter of time before things could start going sideways if they weren't careful. After spending about half an hour at the summit, the 4 climbers decided it was time to head down. Splitting into 2 groups, Saingasa and Kobayashi went first, followed by Yamada and Sato, who started their descent at exactly 3:48 p.m. The first hour went smoothly, with Saingasa and Kobayashi leading the way down at a good pace, quickly reaching the rock face again. But now, things were tricky. The descent here was much more challenging than the climb, which had taken them 2 hours earlier. Kobayashi, being in front, took the lead on the trail ropes, carefully making his way down. It took him some time, but he finally reached the bottom of the rock face and made it to a gentle slope. However, just as he thought he was past the worst of it, he stepped onto a large, overhanging mass of soft snow, unaware that there was no solid ground beneath it. Before he could even react, the massive snow chunk broke loose, and he plunged down the steep face, falling for what seemed like miles. His teammates above had no clue where he would eventually land. All they knew was that the fall would have been fatal. The remaining trio was shocked and devastated by the loss, but the clock was ticking, and they had no time to dwell on their grief. They pushed forward, continuing their descent. About half an hour later, at 5:30 p.m., they reached the point where the fixed ropes were set up and began rappelling down one by one. As they descended, visibility began to drop with the red afterglow of the setting sun falling on the snow. While they had been sticking close together at first, but as the descent went on, they gradually started to spread out. By around 7 p.m., Yamada and Saingasa had made it back to Camp 4, while Sato was still coming down a little behind, following the rope trails. The long exposure to the thin air had really worn him out, and he was struggling. Despite this, his teammates remained hopeful that he'd catch up soon. Even though they couldn't see much with the bad light and constant whiteouts, they had a gut feeling that he had to be close. That turned out to be spot on, when someone from the support staff at Camp 4 yelled out Sato's name, asking if he was okay. Just seconds later, his voice echoed back, telling him that he was on his way down. Hearing him was a massive relief for everyone. They finally had confirmation that he was fine, but after waiting a while, Saigasa decided to go meet him in person just to be sure. He stepped out of camp and climbed a short distance uphill, and sure enough, there was Sato, making his descent down. He looked a bit tired, which was totally expected after that climb. Saigasa called out to him, asking how he was doing. Sato assured him he felt alright, but then as their brief exchange continued, Saigasa asked the same question again, perhaps out of lingering concern or just to double check. And this time, sounding a bit amused, Sato threw the question back at him, almost as if to ask why he was so concerned. He began to say, "What's the matter?" but didn't get the chance to finish his sentence. Out of nowhere, the ground beneath Sato gave way, revealing a dark, gaping void. In what felt like less than a blink of an eye, Sato slipped and fell into the opening, vanishing from sight instantly, just like Kobayashi before him. Saigasa stood rooted to the spot, utterly frozen in shock, watching as sparks flew from Sato's crampons, scraping against the rocks during his fall. Eventually, he returned to camp to break the devastating news. The joy of their success had turned into the depths of despair after losing 2 team members, one after the other. Overwhelmed by grief, the team decided to cancel any further summit attempts and officially abandon the expedition. Search helicopters took to the skies immediately, scouring the mountain for any trace of the missing climbers. For 5 agonizing days, they battled the harsh elements of the mountain, combing the entire south face. But on December 27th, the weather started to worsen and hope ran out, so the operation was called off. To this day, the bodies of these two climbers are still somewhere out there on the unforgiving slope of the killer Annapurna. And as the legendary author Barry Finlay once said, every mountaintop is within reach if you just keep climbing. Yet sometimes, that reach comes with a price that's too high. The Japanese climbers carried that truth with them throughout the whole expedition. They managed to pull off something that seemed impossible, something smart and innovative, but in the end, it all came at a cost that no one should ever have to pay. On August 19, 1966, 6 men were climbing an enormous glacier between two peaks in Chamonix, France. The glacier, Mer de Glace, translates to Sea of Ice. It stretched all the way to Mont Blanc, but the crew's goal today wasn't the famous mountain. Instead, they were there to traverse one of the most challenging climbs in the world, Petit Dreux. The peak's north face is one of the 6 great faces in the Alps, and just 15 years before their expedition, had never been climbed before. It was 3 a.m., so darkness clouded the face of the peak, leaving the group blind. Rain spat down from the heavens, leaving the men soaked and chilling their bones. They carried heavy sacks filled with ropes, pitons, army rations, and sleeping bags. An American, 2 Germans, an Englishman, and 2 Frenchmen made up the group, with some meeting for the first time in a cheap hotel the previous night. Although they were there to scale Petit Dreux in the dark and heavy rain, they weren't there to reach the summit. The group was assembled because 2 young Germans were stuck on a ledge somewhere on the wall, unable to retreat, unable to continue climbing. After all, a thin layer of ice covered the wall due to the freezing rain. A helicopter had confirmed the 2 men were still alive just 2 days prior, but they were running out of time. Gary Hemming, the sole American on the glacier, would push the men forward under challenging conditions. He had a conviction about him that in turn carried the other 5 soaked climbers upwards. Today, Gary was just a great climber from California, but in a few days, he would become one of the most famous people in Europe. This is their story. Five days before Gary Hemming and his crew would climb Petit Dreux, Heinz Romisch and Hermann Schrittel had set out on the same route. Heinz, a 22-year-old student from Germany, had never climbed before with his 30-year-old auto mechanic partner Hermann. The duo was part of a larger group that had met at the campgrounds below the peak, but after camping together, they had decided to team up. Their goal? To complete the 3,730-meter rock and ice climb, Petit Dreux. Petit Dreux is the lower summit of the Grand Aiguille de Dreux. A ridge connects both summits, and the peak is considered one of the most challenging climbs in the world. The north and west faces offer almost 3,000 feet of intense vertical climbing on rock and ice. The faces are nearly as tall as El Capitan in Yosemite, and it caught the eye of alpinists early on, but it was never even considered possible until after World War I. In 1935, some of the best climbers in the world made the first attempt to scale the walls. And in 1952, the first attempts of the west face would take place. And the most challenging part was the 90-meter Didra, a dihedral of granite high up on the face. The expedition was so impactful in the mountaineering community that one of the men on the climb would write a book about the endeavor. On their first attempt, the group of 3 would turn around after a 30-meter granite overhang presented itself to the exhausted group. The following year, they brought more equipment, and this time attacked the route from the north face, placing primitive bolts into the granite, allowing them to entirely skip the section of the west face that had stopped them the prior climb. To progress further, they would complete a 35-meter pendulum to the right, reaching a small but good ledge, and leaving a rope behind if they had to retreat. Then they completed roughly 9 more pitches of lesser difficulty before coming onto easier ground, completing the northwest ridge and eventually the summit. The pendulum that opened the route to the summit would eventually be named German's Ledge. At the time, this was considered the climb of the year and was one of the significant accomplishments in the Alps, earning the name the last great problem of the Alps. Today, the traditional route up the north and west faces has been destroyed by rockfalls, but in 1966, the route was alive and attempted by anyone who wanted to achieve a challenging climb. But the 1950s expeditions didn't have to face something climbers in 1966 would: incredibly bad weather. Hines and Herman made decent progress up the face on the first day. They planned to complete the route in 2 to 3 days, the average time on the wall for most climbers. Because they planned to only be on the wall for a few days, they carried the minimum gear they would need for a 2-man bivouac. This meant they could take a little more food, but would suffer in cold, wet weather. On August 15th, the second day of the expedition, Herman would be climbing a steep vertical wall when he slipped. He would fall over 30 feet before his rope and harness stopped the fall, but doing so, he badly bruised his ribs. His partner Hines was going through his own struggles, as his throat was on fire for most of the day due to dehydration. At times, it would hurt so much that he had trouble swallowing, but despite all the duo's struggles, they continued to make progress up the wall. But that night, they would be tested. A thunderstorm would move into the area and rain on the climbers all night. On day 3, the 2 climbers would start on the most challenging part of the climb, the dehedral. Although the rain had stopped, clouds were again forming overhead, and the intense cold had frozen the rain from the previous night, meaning the wall was now covered in a small sheet of slippery ice. This made impossibly slow progress on the wall. Herman would fall once again, and Hines would have to catch him using his hip belay. But in the process, he would cut both of his hands while trying to secure himself to the wall, causing blood to leak consistently through his fingers. After climbing for over 7 hours, the duo had finished just 90 meters. They had committed to the pendulum, leaving them with 2 options. Number 1, the bolt ladder established in 1952, which led to safety on the less complicated north face. Or, number 2, continuing up the horrible ice 30-meter overhang. But that decision would be made for them. The duo quickly realized that number 2 was off the table, but as they prepared to traverse the bolt ladder, reality would slap them in the face. The ice on the wall had made it impossible for them to traverse the pitch safely. The duo stood on an exposed ledge just beneath the roofs, unable to commit to the overhang or bolt ladder, so they looked back the way they came. But it was useless. Rappelling back through the pendulum was more impossible than the other 2 options because of the weather and the inability to secure a line. They were stuck on a small ledge high up on the northwest face of one of the most challenging climbs in the world. Freezing rain pelted them as they attempted to set up their bivouac to make themselves comfortable. As soon as they were settled in, they removed their red parka and began waving it furiously over the edge, a signal agreed upon before the climb, as a message for help. It took 24 hours before rescue operations were underway. The military school for high mountaineering would lead the rescue. Their plan was to send parties up the easiest route to the summit, the Voie Normale, where they would bivouac, then rappel down the north face to reach the 2 Germans. The only issue? The weather. Although groups of men were ready to make the climb, the weather conditions continued to worsen throughout the day, and by 3:30 p.m., when the rescue was supposed to start, it was nearly impossible for anyone to climb even the safest of routes. There was nothing anyone could do but wait. On August 18th, Gary Hemming was starting his day in a local cafe, reading the newspaper Dauphine Libéré. His partner, Lothar Mao, sat across from him, frustrated because the heavy rainfall outside had ruined their climbing plans for the day. Gary, a 6'4" thin climber from Pasadena, California, was believed to be one of the best in the world. For Gary, as for others of his generation, alpinism was more than a crucible than a sport. He once told a reporter, "The mountain is an initiation that is renewed every year. You go there, you test yourself, you find yourself again. Afterward, you are more able to accept yourself." Gary had made a name for himself in California, but his career would take off after he accepted a friend's invitation to Chamonix in 1960. His friend was John Harland, and together the 2 climbers brought their techniques perfected in Yosemite to the European Alps. The duo would set new routes on some of the most challenging mountains in the world, including a route on Petit Dru that would be named American Direct. But what they really became famous for was their high-altitude mountain rescues. They were part of some of the most essential mountaineering rescues of the 1960s. The only problem was that they were American and didn't fit in with the French mountaineering groups. The Americans disliked the French, and the French disliked the Americans. Even still, there was mutual respect. In 1966, John undertook an expedition on the Eiger with famous climbers, but this group didn't include Gary. On March 22nd, while climbing the murder wall, John's rope would snap and he would fall to his death. A journalist assigned to document the expedition would watch the ordeal through a telescope, and his publication of the event would capture the hearts of the world media. People had a fascination with mountaineering, in particular, the dangers of mountaineering accidents. 5 months later, Gary sat in a cafe eating breakfast while reading the paper. He was still recovering from losing his best friend, but he saw something that interested him. There were 2 German climbers stuck on a small ledge on the northwest route of Petit Dreux. The paper had a detailed plan to rescue the 2 men, including multiple expeditions of over 40 people. Every newspaper in Western Europe carried details of the rescue on its front pages, in part because of the same interest caused by the accident that affected Gary so much. But as he continued to read, he noticed something. He thought that the rescue plan was impossible. The route Gary and John had created on the mountain connected to the northwest face, at precisely where the climbers were stuck. Gary would look at his partner Lothair and state, if they do it like that, trying to go down from the top of the Dreux, they may never get them out. Gary knew very well about the overhangs on the west face. It was almost a perfect coincidence. Gary had climbed the route before and was an experienced high-altitude mountain rescuer. It didn't take long before the duo began making the short trip to the base of Petit Dreux. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, they were already introducing themselves to the head of the rescue team, and that night they would be sitting in a cheap hotel bar, putting together a team of climbers. The first was a young 22-year-old Francois Guillou, who was the youngest mountain rescue official in the area and was known to be somewhat of a prodigy. Additionally, they would recruit Gerard Bauer, another young German who knew the 2 stranded climbers, Géo Baudin, a French guide, and Mick Burke, a talented Brit who had traversed the route before. By 7 p.m., the group of men was on the train headed up to the glacier, preparing to start their rescue climb. The men would set out on the Dreux Couloir in the early morning hours. They carried heavy rucksacks and were soaking wet from the freezing rain. The Couloir in good conditions is a challenging climb, but at 3 a.m. and in freezing rain, it was a death trap. In the sleet, the ledges and slabs were nearly impossible. The men attempted to traverse the first few pitches, but it was no use. They quickly realized they couldn't climb in the current conditions. They would set up their bivouacs for a few hours. In the morning, the rain had stopped and the group of 6 were greeted by 2 more climbers reaching them from below. A man named René de Maison, one of the best alpinists in France, and his photographer, Vincent Morcy. It made logical sense that the group of 6 would become a group of 8, but there was one slight problem. Gary disliked René because René worked for the French magazine Paris Match, which had covered John's death earlier in the year extensively, and not in the best of light. René thought the group of 6 was moving too slowly, and Gary thought René was only there for money. But at the end of the day, joining groups just made sense, so they put their personal differences aside and began climbing as one unit. The new group devised a plan of action. Gary and the young French prodigy Francois would go first, setting the trail. René and Vincent would follow them, and everyone else would bring up the group, carrying the bulk of the equipment. Gary would belay Francois as he furiously climbed his way up the west face. Without the young climber, the group would have been significantly slower up the vertical wall, and as they slowly made good progress on the peak in the town below, word had gotten out about a California man who was leading a rescue expedition, and the press loved it. On August 20th, 3 different groups were attempting to reach the Germans, and each one was getting closer. There were over 40 volunteers still working on the peak, while those on the summit were still trying to lower a steel cable down to the Germans. A group of 4 climbers on the north face were trying to climb from below, and Gary's group of 8 climbing the northwest face. Below on the ground, reporters began swarming to the location, taking pictures and writing stories about the race that was taking place on the peak. Although it was a mountain rescue, It almost felt like a competition to see who would be the one to reach them first and claim the publicity. The rain had started back up, but while it seemed to slow almost everyone down, it didn't slow down Francois. On August 20th, in the freezing rain, he would lead the expedition of 8 to the Didra, an area 300 feet below Hines and Herman. It took Francois 8 hours of climbing in an intense storm to reach the same area that it had taken the Germans over 2 days. And the other 2 groups of rescuers made little progress that day, meaning Gary and his group were the closest to the 2 men. As the sun began to drop, the men, soaking wet and shivering, would try to rest as best they could, but there was little anyone could do to ease the chill in their bones. As the sun rose over the horizon on August 21st, Gary began shouting up to Hines and Herman, and almost immediately they responded. They told Gary that they were both fine, just hungry and cold. Obviously, this was a huge relief for the group of 8, and soon after hearing the news, they packed up their gear and began making their way up the final 300 feet. As Gary's rescue team made their way towards Hines and Herman, the other rescue operations continued to make progress as well. On the summit, the rescue team enlisted some volunteer help, including Wolfgang Eigel, a friend of Hines and Herman. Wolfgang's job was to rappel down to his friends to establish communication and help with the rescue, but as he descended, he lost his balance and twisted within the rope. The harder he fought to free himself, the more entangled he became. It only took a few seconds for Wolfgang to begin to panic. He was suspended below the summit, nowhere to go, and his rope was wrapped tightly around him. He continued to struggle and tried to wiggle his way out of the rope, but it became a noose and wrapped itself around his neck. It only took a minute, and he was gone. Wolfgang had strangled himself on accident, with his own climbing rope wrapped around him. The group of 8 would receive news of the accident as they were closing in on the Germans, but because he was a friend of Hines and Herman, Gary decided to wait to tell them until they were off the mountain, so the group proceeded as if nothing had happened. Around noon on August 21st, Francois and Gary would complete the final pitch and reached the 2 Germans, a whole week after they had started their expedition. Apart from minor injuries, exhaustion, hunger, and freezing temperatures, the 2 men were fine, but the rescue was only half over. Now they had to rappel 2 exhausted men over 900 meters down a slippery, vertical wall. Francois would later describe the descent. At that time, rappelling down a 900-meter face was something enormous, and certainly for Renee and also for Gary, it was a question of pride. They wanted to keep the 2 Germans with them and not give them to the other team. As the men were on the ledge rigging the Germans with nylon harnesses, a helicopter flew overhead, snapping pictures of the entire ordeal. After a few minutes of preparation, the men would begin the descent, and for the next few hours, they slowly made progress down the rock face, while the media continued to document every second. As the sun began to set, the group would reach their bivouac Gary's team had used the night before, 300 feet below the ledge, and just as they settled in for the night, the rain would return, once again, soaking all the men. On August 22nd, the group of 10 spent the entire day descending the peak, and as the sun set, the men stepped on the glacier at the bottom of Petit Dru, soaked and exhausted, concluding the rescue. Over the next few days, camera crews would religiously follow Gary and the 2 Germans. In the black and white footage captured after the rescue, Gary appears tired. His pants are tattered and worn, and a red knit cap is perched at a perfect angle over his head. He laughs easily with the reporters, despite his fatigue. He loves the attention. But still, on the mountain, another rescue is taking place. A rescue with little to no media coverage. Rescuers would rappel from the summit down to Wolfgang's body and cut him loose following the rescue of the 2 German men. From there, his body would be returned to his parents, who had traveled to Chamonix in grief. Because of the intense media coverage, Gary would be elevated to mythic proportions, while Renee would be left with a bitter taste in his mouth for the rest of his life. He always felt Gary received an unfair amount of credit for his rescue, even writing, "Well done, Gary." Gary Hemming was the hero of the hour, the man who saved the 2 Germans, the man everybody wanted to touch and interview and see. You would have thought he had done the entire rescue single-handed. Nobody showed the slightest interest in the rest of us. Francois, the young Frenchman who had set the trail for the expedition, would state, "René hid everything about the job we did. In all his books, he mentions the rescue, and each time his role grows, as if he'd done everything himself. I spent my life looking at what René was writing in his books and saying, bastard, he could have spoken a little bit more about my role." Many of the men on the rescue team would go on to become mountain guides across the world. Over the years, many of them would go on more impressive expeditions, and some would even lose their lives doing what they loved. However, the legacy of the 1966 Petit Drew Mountain Rescue would go down in history as the most watched mountaineering event of all time. Although the expedition was filled with controversy and animosity towards each other, at the end of the day, a team of 8 men saved 2 lives and did it on one of the most challenging mountains in the world. Doug Scott was hanging by a rope off the summit of the Ogre with 2 broken legs, but he is not scared. In fact, this was the first time the expedition had some excitement. Just the night before, he thought to himself that his journey so far had been boring, an unrelenting, long grind that had taken well over a month to reach the summit. Well, it certainly was not dull anymore. Doug couldn't help but find some amusement in this. His only safety net was his partner Chris, standing about 100 feet above him on a ledge. They were 9,000 feet from base camp, and the sun had left the sky an hour ago. The duo was running on fumes, but it was no longer about climbing. The only goal now is to survive. Most mountaineering accidents happen in just a few seconds. An avalanche occurs, a rock falls, or someone slips. The event is over in an instant, and then a rescue happens. But a climb rarely results in an actual survival situation in which the misery or unknown lasts for multiple days. Because of their rarity and intense drama, these tales become legendary. Stories that inspire others to continue when all hope seems lost. And there is none more famous than that of Doug Scott's. This is his story. Banta Brock is a 7,285 meter high mountain known as the Ogre. It is notoriously challenging to climb and is located in the Panma Mustag, a sub-range of the Karakoram mountain range in Pakistan. Its altitude, height above local terrain, and steepness provide a challenge unlike any other. It is a complex granite tower more steep and rockier than all other Karakoram peaks, making rock wall climbing a technical must to reach the summit. But it's because of these features that it's so attractive for extremely high-level mountaineers. Doug Scott always felt like a mountaineer. Born in England, he started climbing at 13, and the world would never be the same because of it. Considered one of the world's leading high-altitude and big wall climbers, few mountaineers alive today don't know his name. His climbs were always lightweight and quick, alpine style. He preferred to move in a small group rather than a large expedition. He was the first Englishman to reach the summit of Everest, where he survived an unplanned bivouac 100 meters below the summit without oxygen or sleeping bags. Scott did not climb just for the views or the thrill. He loved the challenge and hated when a climb was too easy. It made him feel like he didn't deserve his accomplishment. Scott pioneered the sport of big wall climbing, specifically on Baffin Island, Mount Kenya, and in the Karakorams. Big wall climbing is a style of rock climbing that takes place on a massive vertical expanse of rock that requires multi-pitch routes and days of scaling to complete. Due to the sheer verticality and technical skills required, this style is considered one of the most dangerous forms. If you ask an average person what they envision rock climbing to be, it usually is big wall climbing, but on a smaller scale. It was 1977 and the air was tense. There was an ongoing race for glory, to be the first man on top of the Ogre. The technical problems that the mountain provided would be a fun challenge if located in the Alps, but at nearly 24,000 feet, climbing becomes a race against physical and mental deterioration in the oxygen-deprived air. 2 years before, Scott was climbing in the Karakorams when he noticed the mountain. It was beautiful. The giant lumps of rock stood out to him in such a heavily snow-dense area, specifically the South Pillar. a 3,000-foot high rock that Scott knew he would return to conquer. It was because of this moment in 1975 that he organized the expedition to climb it in 1977. Scott learned about how the past 6 years had ended in failure on the Ogre. 2 British and 2 Japanese expeditions were unable to reach the top. All 4 attempts faced avalanche snow, steep rock, and unrelenting storms. The Japanese team reached a high point of 21,500 feet. However, above them lay some of the climb's hardest challenges: 1,000 feet of steep granite rock, steep ice faces, and long ridges before the final 800 feet of summit rock. The group organized included 6 elite mountaineers. Doug Scott and Paul Braithwaite were to try the South Pillar, while Chris Bonington, Mo Antoine, and Clive attempted to reach the summit via the southwest flank. There was no leader, and making a single individual responsible for such an elite group would be laughable. Each man had so much experience that they could reach communal decisions without much debate. The 6 men traveled to base camp together with the help of men who carried their supplies. In some cases, the porters carried bags up to 60 pounds through a 12-mile hike over shifting ice and rock. Doug couldn't help but admire them and how carefully they were when moving, even admitting to himself that it was not something he thought he could do. They reached base camp on June 10th and were full of optimism. Each mountaineer almost instantly wanted to get their feet on the mountain and start climbing, but it would take some time before they could reach the summit. Despite the apparent lack of organization, both teams worked hard to prepare their route. Each individual had a plan to follow and was responsible for tasks like laying a line or moving supplies up to higher camps. However, in the mountains, plans change in an instant. On June 18th, a loose rock on the route Doug and Paul were climbing unlodged itself and smashed into Paul's leg at the start of the South Pillar climb. Luckily, it was not broken, but his leg became severely bruised. Not wanting to give up their 2-year dream, Doug continued to prepare the route solo while he waited for 2 weeks to see if Paul's leg would recover enough to rock climb. It wouldn't. They meticulously recovered all the gear and supplies stashed for their route and returned to base camp. Paul would be unable to continue. While all this was happening, Chris, Nick, Clive, and Mo were busy climbing and fixing ropes in the ice rib leading to the West Col. In less than a week, they rose above advanced base camp at 17,000 feet to 20,000 feet on the Col. At this point, Chris and Nick took off for the top, while Clive and Mo descended due to the lack of supplies and needing more time to acclimatize. Chris and Nick would push up out of the Col, along a ramp and around to the south face. The climb proved to be more difficult than either mountaineer envisioned. The rock was much steeper, and Chris remarked that being stuck on the face in bad weather would be a death sentence. They even spotted fixed lines used by the previous Japanese expedition. The closer they got to the summit, the more Chris thought there would be a clear path, but there simply wasn't. They were near the summit, but the duo had simply run out of supplies and no longer had enough climbing equipment to safely traverse the last section. 4 days later, they would return in failure. A few days later, after all the climbers had recollected themselves, they made a plan to attempt the summit again. Doug, Clive, and Mo set out from camp and returned to the Col. This time, they targeted the West Ridge, and Doug would take the lead for 2 days straight, making good progress. They made it up to the shoulder under the South Pillar and would begin laying rope in preparation for the future days. He thought the climb had been a real grind, and Doug questioned why he was there. But sipping on his hot tea and looking at the sunset with the surrounding mountain range made his questions disappear. The 3 stopped there to wait for Chris. Paul could no longer climb and would stay behind, while Nick caught a cold from his summit attempt and decided it was best if he stayed behind as well. Chris would climb alone and catch up to the other mountaineers. He would quickly work the mountain and join them at about 22,000 feet on the shoulder. The weather took a turn for the worse, and the 4 men had to wait out a storm. There was only one tent, so Chris and Mo created an open bivvy under the stars. It was cold, but the 4 men toughed out the conditions. " On the morning of July 11th, the sky was clear. Each man looked at the other and smiled. This was it. This was their window. They made good progress up the mountain, but overestimated their abilities in high-altitude conditions. Doug led the day's final push, which was one of the most challenging. It was an awkward traverse of steep ground requiring several small movements. They completed this section, and their mood instantly became less tense. The team would not make the summit that day, so instead they dug a snow hole on the shoulder. The next day was spent on a long traverse. First, they had to pass a sheet of ice at a 40-degree angle, followed by a 300-foot slope of snow thinly covering the ice. The team reached the snow hole Chris and Nick had dug up on their previous attempt. They were ready for a summit push the next day. At 5 a.m., Doug and Chris set out. Mo and Clive planned to catch up to them a bit later. They climbed up a rock tower to rappel down on the coal, followed by climbing back up the final rock tower needed to reach the summit. It took hours and was grueling work. They did not have enough rope as they climbed and were forced to pull up their already established lines to continue climbing higher. Doug started on the final steep wall. It was nearly vertical and completely smooth. A thin crack proved useful for anchor placements. He climbed up 8 feet until he was forced to stop. There was no more crack, but there was another one just 20 feet to the right. Doug performed a pendulum-like motion across the wall, running along the face. He had a dozen attempts before finally his hand snagged onto the crack. He resumed his climb up to the overhang, then he pulled himself up over the top. It was now 4 p.m. and there were only 3 hours of daylight left. Clive and Mo decided to return to the snow cave as they were running out of time. Chris and Doug would continue as they now faced the final summit block. There was no way to climb it directly. Instead, they worked around to an overhang groove and used each other as a stepping stone to lift one another over it. Then, they set off on the final couloir. The snow was fresh and deep lying on the mountain. It was unstable and proved to require a lot of energy to walk through. It took nearly an hour to reach the top, but at 7 p.m. on July 13th, Doug and Chris stood on the summit of the Ogre, being the first mountaineers to do so. There was little time to admire their accomplishments, but the pair enjoyed the moment and the view. The sun had set. Doug Scott and Chris Bonington were just now descending from the summit of the Ogre. However, the first traverse proved to be a vertical 150-foot block of rock. They created a nylon sling by threading 2 climbing ropes together and threw it over the ledge. Doug tied himself to the rope and began descending, looking for a crack that had been used on their way up. But it was dark, and he could not see the route well. Doug swung his right foot against the wall and unknowingly placed it on a small layer of ice. His foot flew out from under him, and he fell down. He let out a cry as his body helplessly flew through the air. In an instant, Doug hit the rock. The rope swing caused him to slam into the opposite side of the gully, 100 feet away. His glasses flew off his face, and every bone felt like it was shaken. Quick examination revealed head and butt were okay, but his ankles cracked when trying to move. The right one felt the worst. Doug diagnosed himself with 2 broken legs. The stakes of life and death were just risen, but he had no fear. There was too much to do, to think. Chris quickly swung down on the rope and the pair discussed the situation. They made a plan to continue descending enough until they reached a large patch of snow on a rock slab. There was just enough space for the 2 of them to sit opposite of each other in a half-lying, half-sitting position. The night passed, slowly and painfully. At 5:30 a.m., they set out again, rappelling 4 rope lengths until they reached the snow cave that Mo and Clive were resting in. Mo helped carry gear down, and they spent the day preparing food and carving out a downward path for Doug. The men would return to the snow cave and sleep that night, exhausted. The next day, a blizzard prevented the men from doing anything. The visibility and conditions were just too bad to climb. 2 days after the accident, the sky was clear enough to move. Clive took lead, slowly kicking back the deep snow in order to make a path for the others to follow. Due to their location, the men actually had to climb up about 300 meters, traverse over to the west summit, and then rappel down the other side. They would spend all day moving over the steep ice before finally resting in a different snow cave. That night was brutal. Strong winds and wet snow prevented much sleep. The morning was no different. A storm had settled on the mountain and did not show signs of reprieve. The men had no choice but to keep moving. It was a nightmare. There was a lower level camp with tents that contained food and would be the main goal for the day. However, the route provided no shelter or resting place from the conditions. If they all agreed to climb, there would be no stopping until they made it. Mo led, followed by Clive. Doug would be third, crawling on his knees, but rappelling by rope when he can, and Chris was last. Every inch, every move was painful to Doug. He tried not to think about it. Instead, Doug focused on the task at hand and theorized the best way to descend the 1,000-foot pillar in front of them. Mo went down first and fixed lines that Doug used to rappel down, sliding his body against the rock at an angle while his feet stuck out of the way of obstacles. The group was moving together. Chris was next up and began rappelling off the end of the double ropes. He slipped and fell about 20 feet or so and slammed into the rocks himself. It was not as bad as Doug, but still very painful. Chris would end up breaking 2 ribs and damaging his right hand. The men cursed. They were already in a difficult situation, and this would only make things more difficult. It was cold and getting colder. There was no alternative other than to continue descending. Finally, they reached the bottom of the pillar and to their tent site. They huddled together that night, enjoying each other's company by playing cards, hoping the storm would blow itself out by morning. Chris developed a cough overnight and was starting to become paranoid about his condition, believing that he was developing pulmonary edema. Mo announced that he had not felt his toes in a week, and Clive's hands were also severely numb. It was their 4th day without food. Only a few sugar cubes remained. They decided that nobody had enough energy to battle the storm, and so they waited it out for another day. The next morning, the team roped down to the southwest col. Doug was still crawling by his knees, using multiple layers to protect his skin, but his clothes were starting to wear out. The team found some old ropes used by a previous Japanese expedition, and they were able to slide down about 500 feet to the west col. The first lucky thing that had happened in what felt like days. This invigorated the men and gave them a sense of hope. They found a previous campsite that they had set up before and uncovered a waste bag. At the bottom, they found some boiled rice, which they all shared as they spent the night there. The weather finally started to break the following day, and the men were getting closer to their advanced base camp. Doug would have to take many breaks, as the knee crawling was catching up to him. His arms would sink deep into the snow, and this would last for about a mile. They would do a mix of climbing and crawling for another full day. Chris was in bad shape. He struggled to keep up and coughed up yellow fluid that night. At first light, Mo and Chris set out for advanced base camp. Clive and Doug would follow a few hours later when the sun was in the sky. The closer they got to camp, the more the snow turned to rock, which slowed Doug's progress down significantly. But they would all 4 reach the location of advanced base camp that day, only to find that it was gone. Somebody had packed it up. This was the worst case scenario for all 4 men, as they had no other choice than to keep going to base camp, which stood to be 4.5 miles away from their current location. But in hindsight, it actually made sense. The porters and Nick, who were stationed at the advanced base camp, only had enough food for about a week. It was well past that, and so the only logical solution would have been that they moved to base camp while sending the bulk of the porters to town. After a better analysis, the kitchen area had no tent, but there was a cache of food stashed with a note that stated, "In the unlikely event of you reading this, I have gone down for help." Mo took off for base camp alone, while the other 3 men waited for his return. It took 2 nights, but Mo would reach back up with Nick. At that time, Nick had assumed the worst and was preparing statements to give to each of their families. But upon seeing each other, they were relieved. They got together a group of 12 porters and set out for Doug, Clive and Chris. It would take 3 days before they walked into advanced base camp, and about another 6 before they were all flown out. Looking back on the expedition, inevitably, the descent engulfs the ascent. But it is an epic that will forever be remembered in mountaineering. At no time did any of the men on the descent feel despair or out of control of the situation. On their return to Britain, the men felt irritated. The media took their story and told it as the conquering of the ogre. But no, that is not how Chris or Doug felt. They felt like the ogre had allowed them to climb it, then like a giant cat, played with them all the way down. To this day, there has only ever been 3 summits of the ogre. "64-year-old Lisa Peltola is skiing across a desolate stretch of Arctic terrain on the border between Finland and Norway. It's close to midnight, and she can barely see a few meters ahead. Her new headlamp has proven utterly useless, and the thick haze has swallowed any slivers of moonlight, leaving her surrounded by pitch-black, frozen wilderness. It's been 54 hours of battling this relentless, unforgiving landscape. Bone-chilling winds, looming storm clouds, thick, swirling fog, and above all, endless, waist-deep snow. Every inch she moves forward feels like a fight against gravity, fading into a horizon that just blends into the sky forever. She can't stop. She can't feel the exhaustion seeping in. She can't think about the pain. What began as an exciting expedition has transformed into a desperate fight for survival. Somewhere behind her, sheltered in a snow hole beneath tarps and blankets, her 70-year-old husband lies semi-conscious in his sleeping bag, severely frostbitten, maybe even dead. She doesn't know. All she knows is that if she doesn't keep skiing now, they won't get to see each other again. This is their story. The intense 2-day finale of the World Orienting Championship concluded in the breathtaking landscape of Aviemore, Scotland. From September 24th to the 26th, participants from around the world took part in grueling competitions, cutthroat rivalries, and nail-biting suspense in both individual and relay races. And at the end of it all, the big news was the crowning of that year's world champion, 25-year-old Lisa Väliäläinen. Not only did she take home the gold in the individual event, but she also helped her team snag a silver medal in the relay, marking a monumental achievement for Finnish orienting. For months after her incredible victory, Lisa enjoyed all the recognition and support she rightly earned from fans all over the country. But just when everyone thought she had enough of the limelight already, she revealed something that got even more people talking. Almost a year after her win, Lisa disclosed that she was actually 4 months pregnant during the championship, and while opening up on her experience, she explained how she struggled with severe morning sickness and nausea while getting ready for the event. To the world, it may have seemed like just another sports event, but for Lisa, it was the thing she loved most in her life. She'd first competed in the World Orienting Championships back in 1972, where she placed 40th individually and helped her team land 4th in the relay. Orienting, if you're unfamiliar, is a fast-paced outdoor sport where competitors use a map and compass to navigate from one point to another across challenging and unfamiliar landscapes. Unlike a fixed path, orienters get to choose their own routes between checkpoints, putting their map-reading skills and split-second decisions to the test. The sport has deep roots in Europe and Scandinavia, going back over a century. Initially, it was used as a military training exercise in Scandinavia, but by the mid-1900s, it started catching on with civilians, and by 1966, orienting was officially recognized as a competitive sport, with the first championships soon following. Over the years, it's evolved and expanded across the globe, with versions for different terrains like mountain biking, foot races, and even ski orienting. Before 1993, however, it was primarily limited to individual and relay races, making Lisa's early experiences even more unique as she competed in a sport that was still evolving. Yet, exactly 12 years before making history as Finland's first orienting world champion, Lisa didn't even know how to read elevation lines on a map. Born in 1951, she grew up with a love for the outdoors that defined her childhood. She was adventurous, determined, and full of energy, but most of all, she never gave up on anything she set her mind to. When she was 13, she and her brother ventured into the forest with a compass for the first time, and that's when her love for orienting truly clicked. And with the sport just starting to gain traction in other Nordic countries, it didn't take her long to realize that she wanted to go all in and pursue it professionally. However, it still took her almost 5 years of practice before she fully understood those tricky, nested curves on the map that seemed like a foreign language at first. In 1972, she was only 21 years of age when she made her debut at the Orienting World Championship, representing Finland. Things didn't go exactly as she hoped in the individual race, but she was super close to leading her team to Finland's first World Cup relay win. Now, while Lisa was naturally a tall and athletic woman, which gave her an edge in her sport, she didn't just coast on that. Her training regime was pretty intense. With her husband, Seppo Väljäläinen, as her coach, she trained for days, often in rough swamps and rugged terrains, honing her skills and endurance. And when they could steal a moment away from their busy lives, the couple loved to spar on the judo mat, keeping their competitive spirits alive. Throughout her impressive career, Lisa scored a total of 16 gold medals and 6 silvers. Out of those golds, she snagged 4 at the World Championships, with 3 of them coming from relay events. But for Lisa, orienting was never just about competition. She always saw it as something she would carry with her throughout her life. She wanted to transform it into a civic skill instead of just being a sport. In her interviews, she'd often point out, even the berry growers don't dare to go more than a couple of 100 meters from the highway because they're afraid of getting lost in the forest. She really believed that orienting was a skill everyone should have, not just athletes. That's why, even after hanging up her competitive shoes, she couldn't stay away from the sport. She'd often go on solo trips, immersing herself in nature and recharging in the wild. And while those adventures would take a major share of her time, her personal life was just as eventful. Her once cherished and passionate bond with her husband eventually changed, and the couple ultimately parted ways. Yet for Lisa, this relationship journey didn't turn out to be as dry as she had anticipated. She'd soon find a new romantic interest in her old friend and teammate, Tuomo Platola. Tuomo and Lisa had known each other since 1969, but it wasn't until 1983, when they both joined the same club, that things really started to heat up. At first, they were just friends, but Tuomo couldn't help but catch feelings for her. The guy was a bit of a chicken though, and never mustered up the courage to tell her how he felt. Despite being an athletic engineer and a multiple Jukola relay winner, Lisa's adventurous spirit intimidated him a little. He would often joke that she reminded him of Pippi Longstocking with her wild energy. Still, they had a blast together, going on trips and hanging out, but it took them decades to finally admit their feelings for each other. Then on February 29, 2012, right before midnight, Lisa took the plunge and proposed to him. They tied the knot later that same year. However, the newlyweds didn't change up their routines much. Even though Lisa was 61 and Tuomo was 67 when they got married, they still kept their love for skiing and orienting alive, while juggling their work to make a living. For the next 3 years, things went on like this, until March 2015 came around. The couple was finally ready for a long overdue trip to Lapland, which is Finland's northernmost region bordering Sweden, Norway, Russia, and the Baltic Sea. Their expedition was set to last 4 days, where they planned to navigate through rocky slopes and rugged mountainous terrain, while stopping at various checkpoints along both sides of the Norway-Finland border. And while they were experts at their craft, and even had visited this area before, this time, the weather was shaping up to be the biggest hurdle. Sitting pretty much entirely above the Arctic Circle, Lapland is notorious for its harsh snowfall in March and April. Temperatures can plunge to a bone-chilling 21 degrees Fahrenheit to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and the biting winds can make it feel even colder, creating dangerously low wind chill factors and terrible visibility during snowstorms. And because of that, they can only expect about 10 hours of daylight during that time of year. However, Lisa and Tuomo weren't the kind to let a few worries get to them. On Sunday morning, March 29th, 2015, they woke up bright and early before the sun came up and chowed down on breakfast, getting their energy up for the adventure ahead. They packed all their gear, loaded up on skiing equipment, thermal clothes, insulated jackets, and waterproof boots to handle the frigid temperatures. They made sure to bring plenty of high-calorie food and navigational tools to tackle the harsh conditions ahead. Once all that was sorted, their first leg of the adventure was a 2-day drive north to Lapland, covering about 745 miles from their home in southwest Finland. While the exact starting point is a bit of a mystery, it was roughly 7.5 miles from Lussajärvi Valley, which was their planned first stop. They reached the starting point at around 4 p.m. and hit the trail on foot. The trek to Lussajärvi was expected to take about 3 to 4 hours, and if the weather played nice, they should have arrived there by around 7 p.m. Lussajärvi Valley is a popular spot for hikers seeking shelter from tough weather conditions during their expeditions to the Arctic. Along with essential gear and basic medical help, this area is known for an open wilderness hut called Autiotivat. It's part of a network of shelters run by the state, scattered all over Lapland, often found on remote trails. They give hikers a chance to rest or spend the night without needing a reservation. Typically, these temporary residences come with a wood stove, bunk beds, and some basic cooking gear, making them a must-have for anyone tackling the tough northern terrain. Best of all, they're free to use on a first-come, first-served basis. Lisa and Tuomo were counting on finding that hut to crash for the first night. What they didn't realize was that the weather they had downplayed earlier was about to turn into a nightmare they would remember for the rest of their lives. They clipped their skis, with Tuomo taking the lead as they pushed out into the Arctic's vast white expanse. At first, everything felt like a dream. The miles slid by easily, and excitement pulsed with every glide. They wove through a forest of frozen birch trees, their branches heavy with ice that glistened like glass sculptures, making the whole scene feel like a winter wonderland untouched by the world. Every risk felt worth it, and for a while, it was pure magic. But about an hour in, things started to shift. The temperature dropped, and the wind's bite grew sharper against their cheeks. In the Arctic Circle, they knew how fast the weather could turn. One moment, the sky might be clear, and the next, a thick whiteout could descend. They were used to the unpredictability, so they kept going, not too worried, at least, not yet. Ahead of them, the flat land was coming to an end, leading up to a steep slope that they need to climb to continue up the mountain. With the wind picking up as they gained altitude, they had to move sideways along the slope, keeping their skis firmly against the icy surface to prevent sliding backwards. It took them twice as long as expected to reach the top, and by the time they finally summited, exhausted after 3 hard hours, it was already 7 p.m. They should have been at the hut by now, but not only was the hut nowhere in sight, dark, heavy clouds had wrapped around them, making it impossible to see the way forward. Still, the orienter in them urged to press on, and the near total whiteout and dimming daylight, Lisa and Tuomo kept moving in what they believed was the right direction for nearly another hour, expecting the hut to appear at any moment. But the white just stretched endlessly into more white, until finally, they couldn't see anything at all through the darkness. This is when they realized the worst thing possible in that huge frozen landscape. Their compass was malfunctioning. Not only could they not figure out which way to go, but there was a fair chance they'd been off course right from the start. And with visibility reduced to nothing, their only guide was that faulty compass, which could have been malfunctioning for who knows how long. Now, as they glanced at their map, it all felt out of sync. They tried using their GPSs, but it had lost reception, leaving them stranded without a single working navigation tool in the remote, high-altitude wilderness. For most people, panic would be a given at this point, but not Lisa and Tuomo. They'd faced a lot of intense situations before, so they were pretty sure they could handle this when the visibility got better. Right then though, their only move was to hunker down and wait out the long night. As they decided to set up camp, they realized they hadn't packed any snow shovels because they didn't expect to be camping on ice, so they ended up spending nearly half an hour digging a snow cave with their skis and bare hands, just big enough for both of them. When inside, Tuomo stretched a waterproof tarp over the cave's narrow entrance to block out as much snow and wind as possible, then layered another over their sleeping bags to help trap body heat. Lisa quickly drifted off, but around midnight, Tuomo woke up, feeling the damp chill of his sleeping bag iced over from the condensation dripping from the ceiling. While Lisa managed to get a decent rest, he lay there, trying to ignore the noise of the wind and snow pelting the tarp above. And by morning, Tuomo was stiff, sore, and still exhausted. The night hadn't done much to ease his fatigue, but with no choice but to push on, they decided to take a quick meal before setting off again. Tuomo, once again too worn out to eat much, settled for some instant coffee, while Lisa had bread and cheese to keep her strength up for the long day ahead. At around 8 a.m., they finally poked their heads out of their cave and noticed that the wind had calmed down a bit. The sun was rising and visibility was pretty good. Since they couldn't rely on their compass anymore, they decided to head east using the sun as their guide. They believed that if they stayed on the right path, they would eventually come across the massive reindeer fence that marked the border between Finland and Norway, where they hoped to find someone to help them. And even if they didn't, all they had to do was follow that fence to reach Lossujärvi Valley and their hut. On paper, that was the right move, but they had no idea just how far off course they had already wandered by that time. They were trapped in a valley about 23 miles from where they were supposed to be. And while this was one of the two paths that could get them to Lossujärvi, it was the longer and way more dangerous one. The valley was all over the place, rising to the southeast and full of jagged rock ridges, which made it super hard to escape if you didn't have a good sense of where you were. However, completely unaware of the trouble, they set off again, with Lisa taking the lead this time. They cruised along for a few hours, but as the weather started to turn, Tuomo felt the alarm bells ringing. He kept shouting and whistling for her to slow down. Sometimes she would hear him, but other times the wind would drown him out, and she'd just keep going, until she realized she had left him behind and sprinted back in a panic. Tuomo was really struggling. Every step felt like torture, and he had to stop every few meters to catch his breath, leaning on his knees and hanging his head in exhaustion. At one point, he even tumbled down a slope, and Lisa had to ski over to help him. She took off his helmet and skis to lift him back up and helped him relax, at least for a little bit. With all that going on, they skied on a mix of ice and snow for hours, until once again, nothing made sense on the map. Still, they continued under the moonlight. But soon enough, they were so exhausted that they couldn't move anymore, deciding to call it a day and spend another night in the snow. Once again, they dug out some snow to make a little cave for themselves and settled in. For dinner, they ate some snacks, but their water bottles were frozen solid. Somehow, they managed to melt some snow using their almost empty burner for a bit of hydration. This night was even colder than the last, and neither of them could get any decent sleep. To make things worse, Tuomo started shaking uncontrollably and slipped into a semi-conscious state. The next morning, he found himself utterly trapped in his sleeping bag, unable to muster the strength to get out. Still, he forced himself into his skis for one last attempt, but as they both set off, after every few minutes, he had to stop and catch his breath for a long time. On top of that, the relentless whiteout made everything a blur, and he kept losing his balance, falling over again and again. It felt like trying to walk with his eyes shut. One moment, the ground would be flat, and in an instant, it would pitch downward, sending him tumbling if he wasn't steady on his feet. As the hours dragged on, his physical exhaustion began to morph into mental confusion. He'd hear a helicopter and the distant sound of a motorcycle with a sidecar, struggling to convince himself that motorcycles didn't ride in such rugged terrain. They pushed through like that for almost 12 more hours, until nearly 7 p.m. when Tuomo finally told Lisa he couldn't go another step. They took a quick 20-minute break, but Lisa realized if he pushed on, he might just drop dead before they got anywhere. She figured the hut couldn't be too far now, so she decided to leave him behind to wait while she went to find help. She thought it would only take a few more hours to reach the hut, but once again, it was a complete miscalculation. Instead of wasting time digging another snow cave, she helped him into a sleeping bag, covered him with a tarp, and got ready to head out alone. But with visibility getting worse, she was scared she might not find him again after getting help, especially since they'd been trying to reach their first stop for 3 days, when it was supposed to take just a couple of hours. So to leave some kind of marker, she stuck Tuomo's skis into the snow vertically and hung her flashlight from the tip to act as a beacon for her return. After spending almost an hour getting her husband all set up, she decided to hit the slopes again around 8 p.m., but it took her another hour of skiing around to realize she was just going in circles. Worrying about her husband, she figured she should head back and check on him, but on the way, the lamp she'd left to light the way had died. Maybe the battery gave out, or maybe she was just heading the wrong way again. All her tracks were now buried under fresh snow, and not only had she lost her husband, but she hadn't found the hut either. After another half hour of searching in all the wrong places, she thought it might be better to just camp out for the night and keep looking in the morning. Another day had gone by since they had gotten stuck in this situation, and now she was alone, wondering if Tuomo was still alive, or if he had already succumbed to the snow. Lisa spent the whole night questioning her choices. The next morning rolled in with a heavy feeling in the air. If she didn't get help by the end of the day, it wasn't just her husband who was definitely going to die if he wasn't already, but there was also a high chance that she might end up dead too, all because of the activity she loved doing the most. Time was running out and she was staring down two tough choices. She could either head back to check on Tuomo or keep pushing forward to find the hut. If she turned back, even if she found him, there wasn't much she could do to help. They could end up stuck together, which wouldn't help anyone. On the flip side, if she kept looking for the hut, there was a shot she could get help for both of them. It was a hard call, but deep down, she knew going forward was the right move. So she steered herself and chose to keep going. It was morning and the visibility was looking way better. Off in the distance, she spotted a mountain slope, and luckily, there weren't any clouds around to cause a whiteout. That meant if she could get to the top and see clearly, she might actually spot the hut from up there. She munched on some crumbled cookies she had stuffed in her pocket and skied up the mountain as fast as she could. Thankfully, she made it just in time, and to her surprise, there it was, the hut, sitting way out in the middle of nowhere. A huge wave of relief hit her as she took note of the direction, realizing she could reach it in just a couple of hours. Feeling pumped and more determined than ever, she set off again around 9 a.m. And exactly 2 hours later, she spotted the hut peeking through the snowy haze. That moment was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. At first, she noticed there were no vehicles or people around, but there were various footprints outside the hut, which meant someone had to be nearby. So she decided to head inside and wait for whoever it was to show up. After more than an hour, a Norwegian-speaking reindeer herder pulled up on a snowmobile. He introduced himself as Ole Thomas Ball in his best broken Finnish and asked if she was alone. Despite the language barrier, Lisa managed to explain that her husband was still out in the direction she came from, and he needed help immediately. Ole stoked the fire, shared some food with her, and then hopped back on the snowmobile to search for Tuomo. After riding into the dead white wilderness for several minutes, he finally found Tuomo draped in a tarp and almost buried in the snow. At first glance, it looked like he was gone, but when he checked his heartbeat, there was still a faint pulse. He quickly called emergency services, who dispatched a helicopter to come and rescue them. It took another half hour before Tuomo and Lisa were finally rescued, after almost 70 hours, and attended by medics, but by that time, Tuomo's body temperature had dropped to just 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Due to severe and prolonged hypothermia, he was diagnosed with an acute circulatory disorder in the intestines, kidney failure, breathing issues, frostbite, and circulatory problems in his ankles, feet, hands, and arms. Each of these conditions was life-threatening on its own. The ends of his toes were black, skinless at the base, and red, resembling a peeled shrimp. At the hospital in Norway, doctors started the slow process of bringing his body temperature back to normal by circulating his blood through a warmer and injecting it back into his body. Miraculously, he began to show signs of recovery in about a week and a half, but they had to amputate all of his toes and also remove a 3-foot-long piece of frozen intestine from his body. Lisa, on the other hand, only suffered frostbite in her thumb, but thankfully it wasn't serious enough to require amputation. Tuomo eventually made a full recovery and took his time dealing with post-traumatic stress and getting used to life without his toes. Once nearly dead in a vast, unforgiving expanse, alone and helpless, buried under the snow, Tuomo came back to life and eventually passed away at home among his loved ones on August 18, 2021, at the age of 75. Reflecting on his traumatic experience, he would humorously recall how he had complete faith in his strong and resilient wife that she would find a way to get them both out of their predicament. He'd say, "I thought that when I fell asleep tired enough, Lisa would come back with a solution. We were committed to this together. I take care of sleeping, Lisa takes care of the rest." Then he'd pose a thought-provoking question. If you don't know where you're starting from, and you don't know where you're going, can you find your way there? Tuomo would answer it himself. Lisa can. It was a miracle. It's an unusually clear day at the top of the 6th highest peak in New Hampshire. With February just settling in, the wind chills and freezing temperatures have hit record lows, and the biting cold is making the rugged climb up Mount Lafayette a challenge straight out of a survival movie. For adrenaline seekers, though, it's just another epic trek to the 1,600-meter summit. By 2 p.m., Milford hiker Marty Sample is descending a steep stretch of the mountain called the Old Brittle Path. He'd set out early, bumped into a few fellow hikers on his way up, and now with daylight slipping away, everyone's hustling back to camps before the cold and dark set in. However, before that would happen, something unusual caught Marty's eye. As he descended, he saw a lone figure making his way up the mountain. It was late for that. Too late. The man didn't blend in with the crowd of modern hikers Marty had seen all day. His thick, heavy beard framed a face weathered by time. His sinewy build carried a quiet resilience, and his height, barely 5'6", bent further by age or exhaustion, gave an unassuming presence. But there was something more about him. Despite the hunched posture and slow, deliberate steps, his movements spoke of experience. Marty could tell this man knew these mountains better than most. He clutched an old wooden alpenstick and a small, worn backpack, the kind of gear that didn't scream ambition, but rather familiarity. Perhaps he wasn't aiming for the summit, just heading toward one of the huts a little further up on the trail. Marty gave a polite hello as they passed. The man, without breaking stride, nodded back. Brief, almost dismissive. For a moment, Marty glanced over his shoulder, watching as he steadily disappeared up the trail. The encounter lingered in his mind. Not creepy, not alarming, just peculiar. But he didn't dwell on it for long. He kept moving, assuming that man knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't until days later that Marty learned the truth. That lone figure wasn't just any hiker. He was one of the most legendary climbers of the White Mountains, Guy Waterman. But that day, Guy wasn't just climbing a mountain. He was climbing his favorite mountain one last time, with no intention of ever coming back down. What's even more haunting is the weight Guy was carrying up that trail. A lifetime of unshakable pain, loss, and inner turmoil. After years of struggling, this was his way of trying to end the agony once and for all. But what he sought wasn't what he found. Even in death, peace didn't come. One has to wonder, on that fateful day, did Guy Waterman truly believe his climb would bring him the solace he so desperately wanted? There are people who think he didn't. This is his story. Forest and crag, wilderness ethics, backwood ethics, Yankee rock and ice, and a fine kind of madness. 5 books, one dynamic duo of writers, and a shared passion driving every page. Classic mountain folklore served with a side of hard facts and a near-obsessive mission to keep modern gadgets and careless thrill seekers from ruining the untamed beauty of the mountains. That's how Guy Waterman spent the last 27 years of his life, off-grid on a 27-acre homestead with his partner, carving out a life far from the noise of the modern world. But while his final days were steeped in grief and heartbreak, the journey that led him there couldn't have been more different. It started out as a dream life, brimming with ambition, achievements, and the kind of moments most people only dare to imagine. Guy Van Vorst Waterman was born on May 1st, 1932 in New Haven, Connecticut, as the youngest of 5 kids. His dad, Alan Tower Waterman, was a Yale physics professor, and while Guy was still young, he landed a huge role as the first director of the National Science Foundation, which meant the family was constantly on the move, following Alan's career. Their first step was Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Guy discovered an interest for baseball that later turned into a lifelong passion. He'd eventually write for baseball magazines and even become a dedicated member of the Society for American Baseball Research. But before all that, in 1946, the family packed up and moved to Watertown, Connecticut, where Guy enrolled at Taft's School and found his new passion, jazz piano. After yet another move, this time to Washington, D.C., Guy wrapped up his high school, and by the age of 16, he was already making a living playing with a ragtime band called Riverboat Trio. Apart from being a typical physicist, Guy's dad had 2 big interests outside of work: politics and the great outdoors. He was an old-school Roosevelt liberal and a seasoned outdoorsman. From a young age, Guy picked up on both of his dad's passions, but ended up embracing one and going in the complete opposite direction with the other. As a teenager, he became a stout Republican, but the two still spent many summers canoeing and hiking through the north woods of Maine and New Hampshire. Those trips brought out a side of him that stuck way more than his love for music or baseball ever did, though at the time, he didn't really see it. By the time he hit 18, the father-son friction came to a head again. Guy wanted to marry his high school sweetheart, Emily Morrison, and his dad wasn't on board. He told Guy he was too young to get married, but after some back and forth, he eventually gave in to his son's determination. They got married in 1950, and by the time Guy graduated from George Washington University in 1953, he and Emily already had 2 sons, with a third one on the way. It was around then that it hit him. He needed a steady job. Music, which had been his side hustle, wasn't going to cut it anymore. So with his economics degree, he landed a role as an economist at the Washington Chamber of Commerce from 1955 to 1958. But politics had a magnetic pull on him he couldn't ignore. Soon, Guy ended up working as a legislative aide for the Senate Minority Policy Committee and crafting speeches for big names like President Dwight Eisenhower, Vice President Richard Nixon, and Congressman Gerald Ford. For 2 years, he thrived in that whirlwind, but when Nixon lost the 1960 election, Guy packed up the family and moved to Stamford, where he took on a dual role at General Electric as a speechwriter and labor negotiator. On paper, life seemed great. Guy was climbing the financial ladder, earning respect and keeping his creative spark alive with his speechwriting gigs. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. While his coworkers were living it up in the corporate world, Guy would take long walks through Manhattan alone, sandwich in hand, sitting down at random spots to think. He couldn't help but feel out of place, like he just didn't fit into the buttoned-up life everyone else seemed so comfortable with. Leaning more into that side of himself, he joined the New York chapter of the Appalachian Mountain Club, or AMC, and in 1963 learned how to rock climb up in the Shawangunk Mountains. Just 3 years later, with the family dog tagging along, Guy and his 2 oldest sons, Bill and Johnny, managed to climb New Hampshire's 46th highest mountains in only 14 days, setting a new record. But while the pull of the mountains started pushing him to break free from the corporate grind, things at home were falling apart. What was once a passionate and romantic marriage had turned into something dull and strained. Maybe Guy was starting to see that his dad had a point. Getting married so young might have been a mistake. In 1969, he and Emily decided to call it quits and went their separate ways. For Guy, though, this was just the start of a whole new chapter. He started spending more time in the mountains, and that summer he crossed paths with a new member of the AMC who caught his attention like no one else had. She was a 30-year-old book editor named Laura Johnson, who just like Guy was chasing the mountains in her free time. Both Guy and Laura clicked instantly, and those wide-eyed trails and stunning views of the Shawangunk Mountain became the backdrop to their time together. They'd climbed side by side, hike, camp, relax, and enjoy being outside, doing what they loved while loving it even more with each other. It wasn't long before they started dreaming of a life away from the hustle and bustle of society. In 1970, during a climbing trip to the White Mountains, a friend handed them a book called Living the Good Life, which gave them just the right push they needed. In the book, the writers Helen and Scott Nearing shared the story of their self-sufficient farm in Vermont, where they lived organically and free from the clutter of modern life. Guy and Laura knew right away they were doing this. In 1971, they bought a 27-acre homestead in Vermont and named it Barra, after the Waterman's family's ancestral homeland. The following year, they tied the knot and wasted no time moving into their new property. There they built a modest one-room cabin, complete with a disconnected toilet and Guy's beloved Steinway piano. Far from the chaos they wanted to escape, they found plenty of work to keep their calendar full all year long. The winter was all about ice climbing and trekking through the mountains. When spring rolled around, they'd tap a grove of sugar maple to make syrup. Living at Barra meant they had switched to a vegetarian lifestyle, so their vegetable garden kept them busy from late April to early June. After that, they had more time for climbing and hiking during the summer. But this was soon followed by canning, harvesting root vegetables, and weeks of chopping firewood for the winter. By Thanksgiving, they'd head out for more hiking. With no running water at Barra, they carried water up from a stream using a bucket and bathed in an old cattle trough. For nearly 2 decades, they lived on a budget of just $3,000 a year, until 1994 when Guy's Social Security made things a little easier. Before that, their only income came from freelance writing. But their tight budget wasn't even the toughest part of life at Barra. They had no phones, no electric lights, no computers, no radio, no motors. Basically nothing mechanical at all. Whatever they did, from the smallest of tasks to the toughest of chores, they'd always do it by hand. It's the kind of lifestyle that would be tough for even the youngest folks to keep up with for that long. And here they were, getting into their middle years, still at it. Their car was pretty much the only thing they gave in to when it came to modern tech, and even that was parked way out on the property, keeping it at what they called a safe distance. If they needed to use it, they'd have to trek through almost a mile of snow just to reach it. This kind of near-obsessive resistance to convenience and attention to details stayed with them the whole time they were at Barra. Before they even settled in, Guy made a list of 10 principles they'd live by. Every morning, he'd post a calendar page for the day with historical events, personal milestones, a daily quote, and whatever else popped into his head. Guy's notebooks and clipboards tracked every little thing that went on in or around the property, whether it was what they were growing, a bird that flew by, or even a random squirrel. He never left the house without 5 index cards in his left pocket, each one a different color. The red card was for tracking every penny spent that month. The yellow one held the day's chores, though the blue one had their shopping list, the orange covered short-term projects, and the green one was saved for the bigger tasks that had to get done by the season's end. In the book they took inspiration from, the homestead was painted as this cozy getaway, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, where everyone could drop by, hang out with the owners, and soak in the wholesome vibes. But the Watermans weren't really on the same page when it came to this part. They valued their peace and quiet way too much for that kind of open-door policy. When reporters came by for interviews, they were strictly told not to reveal the homestead's location, worried that it'd turn into a tourist attraction, with Guy and Laura becoming, in their own words, the prized specimens. A part of this reclusive nature stemmed from the fact that Guy, while seemed to have moved on with his life, was still reeling from family issues. The same year he divorced Emily and met Laura, his 18-year-old son Bill, who had just graduated high school, severely injured his leg trying to hop onto a freight train. Guy had been training his sons to be top-notch climbers, so he put everything on the line and made Bill go through a bunch of surgeries to save his leg. But after a few years, the leg had to be amputated, and Bill got a prosthetic. Then when Guy married Laura, his relationship with his sons took a major hit. He always felt they never really forgave him for moving on. The first few years at Barra went by just like that. Guy barely saw his family, and even though his other son, Johnny, who was about a year younger than Bill, kept climbing and shattering records every year, Guy still kept his distance. In fact, on their trip to Alaska to climb Mount Hunter, Guy came and went without even stopping by to see Johnny, who was living in Fairbanks at the time. Then almost 2 years after settling in Barra, Bill, who had been struggling with the fallout from losing his leg, sent a short letter to Guy and the rest of the family. It said he was going on a long trip, but he didn't say exactly where. Some rumors suggest he went north to live with the Inuit tribe, but either way, that was the last anyone heard from him. Bill just disappeared. Johnny kept living and climbing in Alaska. In 1978, he shocked the climbing world with a solo ascent of the southeast spur of Mount Hunter, which had never been climbed before. But after that, he somehow got obsessed with tackling the hardest climbs, which was totally different from Guy's idea of climbing. For Johnny, it wasn't so much about the thrill or experience. It was more of a challenge, something to prove. To him, if he made it out alive, then it wasn't really a climb worth calling hard. In 1981, at 28 years of age, Johnny set his sights on the ultimate challenge of a solo winter ascent of Denali's East Face. Back then, it was considered one of the toughest climbs, but Johnny seemed pretty unconcerned about the risks involved. And that's when everything went south for him. Johnny didn't survive the climb and never made it back down. When he was last seen, witnesses reported that he was carrying dangerously low gear, which might have made surviving the mountain's brutal conditions impossible. In the end, it was his uncalculated, daredevil approach that led him to give up his life in a way that left his body never to be found. The incident left a deep scar on Guy's personality. In the first 10 years of life at Barra, he had already been through the worst tragedies he'd ever face. His only escape was the wilderness he'd thrown himself into. So he tried to find some peace out there. He picked a quiet spot on the ridge, south of Mount Lafayette's summit, built a cairn of stones, and buried an old pair of Johnny's boots beneath it. Every year, on the anniversary of Johnny's disappearance, Guy and Laura would hike up to the cairn and sing laments in Johnny's memory. Mount Lafayette wasn't just any mountain for Guy. It had been special from day one. When he set the record for climbing the 46 highest peaks in New Hampshire with the Sons, Mount Lafayette was the first one they conquered. That trip also marked his first real escape from the corporate grind he hated, which made it even more meaningful. He even went back to Lafayette later with 3 of his sons, and those hikes turned into some of the happiest memories of their lives, before circumstances tore them apart. And now, with Johnny's boots buried there, the mountain became his second home. For 18 years, Guy and Laura poured their hearts into mountaineering, in taking care of the trails around Mount Lafayette. Outside of Barra, it was the only place Guy truly felt at home. Apart from their non-stop schedule of living off the grid, Guy and Laura managed to co-author 5 books over the years. Most of their writing revolved around the same themes of clean camping and leaving no trace in the wilderness. Guy was also pretty outspoken against the use of modern technology in mountaineering. In his 4th publication, Backwood Ethics, published in 1993, he went all out, slamming everything from helicopter rescues and loud hiking groups to cell phones and gadgets. His take was pretty straightforward. If you're going to risk climbing a mountain, you should be ready to handle the consequences. Over time, his aversion to modern conveniences only got stronger. What he didn't see coming, though, was the irony. He'd eventually find himself in the exact situation he spent his life rallying against. And worse, it would be entirely by choice. But before all that came what would become the hardest chapter of his life. Guy and Laura's first book came out in 1979, and although it started off strong, catching the attention of hikers and environmentalists, it couldn't go much further than a few thousand copies. That same year, the Appalachian Mountain Club asked them to write a detailed recreational history of the northeastern mountains. The couple thought it would take 3 years to wrap it up, but it ended up dragging on for a decade. When they finally handed it in, AMC told them it was way too long and made them cut out the chapters on technical climbing. That extra work didn't go to waste though. It ended up becoming a separate book later on. But even with that, Guy couldn't shake the feeling that his work wasn't getting the recognition it deserved. Over time, personal losses, his growing frustration with the modern world, and the grind of trying to make it all work only made that feeling worse. In his memoir, he reflected on it all. writing, a few people have said some very nice things about our books, but on the whole, they and our ideas about eastern wilderness seem to be sinking into oblivion, unnoticed. All this is accompanied by a feeling that I could have done better. On top of everything, the biggest concern bugging them was the realization that they too were somehow becoming part of the problem they'd been fighting against for years. In 1995, they published an article called Saving the Wilderness, From Whom? In it, they explained how they'd been holding annual get-togethers in the White Mountains for years, but over time, they started noticing that these reunions, getting bigger and livelier each year, were starting to go against their own beliefs about preserving peace, solitude, and respect for nature, messing with the overall backcountry experience they valued so much. To stay true what they believed in, they made the tough call to stop those gatherings, even though it meant giving up something they really enjoyed. However, that wasn't the end of the story. Around the same time, Laura's knees gave out, and she couldn't hike anymore. Guy, on the other hand, started feeling disconnected from the mountains too. For years, they had completely dominated the New Hampshire peaks. Laura had climbed all 48 1,200 meter peaks at least 7 times, while Guy was practically living on them. He managed to climb each one of them for a total of 16 times, including winter ascents from all 4 directions. But as the 1990s went on, Guy started realizing hiking was turning into more of a technical, gymnastic challenge, not the wilderness experience he once loved. He couldn't help but feel out of place with these newer trends, and if that was the direction things were heading, he hated them too. When people asked what made him feel that way, he'd often joke, "My rock shoes are worn out." His friends didn't take him literally, but they knew he was really pointing to modern trends and how they made him feel like an outsider. Another reason for his gloomy behavior came from a chronic stomach issue that never really got figured out. Some doctors thought it could have been colitis, maybe from drinking that stream water they'd been using forever, or it could have been something totally different. Either way, his doctors were pretty sure it was life-threatening, but Guy, being who he was, refused to undergo any invasive tests. Though he acted like he was strong and that his condition had only made him tougher, his friends could see he was struggling with severe depression, and his mood swings were getting worse. At one point, he even started having episodic bouts. And then came the worst of it yet. On July 3rd, 1998, Guy left Laura at Barra and went for a day of solo hiking in the White Mountains. When he returned that evening, he told her he had climbed to the top of a cliff with the intention of throwing himself off, but had not been able to go through with it. Laura was stunned at first, but then she thought, since he was opening up, maybe he was getting past those thoughts. Sadly, this wasn't the case. Guy started dropping little hints for his friends, telling them in subtle ways that he wouldn't be around for long. He'd mention his memoir, casually saying, "It's all done, except for the last page." Besides that, whenever he wrote notes or letters to his friends, he'd write in the first-person plural tone, speaking for both himself and Laura. But as his mental health took a nosedive, it became just about him, with the letters feeling more like a goodbye, as if he was trying to make sure his friends understood what he had planned. He even went on asking a couple of his friends to bring a cassette recorder to Barra so he could tape himself playing a few of his favorite waltzes. They knew it was for his memorial service. That part, though, is the most haunting of the whole thing. At one point, his friends and Laura knew what he was planning, but none of them could do anything to talk him out of it. They just figured it wouldn't happen anytime soon. But with Guy Waterman, nothing had ever been predictable. That fateful day came crashing way too early. On Sunday, February 6, 2000, Guy got up early, sticking to his usual routine of writing by the glow of a kerosene lamp and waiting for Laura to wake up too. When they finally sat together around 8:30 in the morning, he handed her a few typewritten pages from his memoirs. But when Laura looked at his face, she immediately felt something was off. Perhaps she could sense that it might be the last time she'd ever see him. But after their short exchange, Guy headed out the door, starting his mile-long trek through the snow to where their car was parked. He drove over to the post office, mailed some letters to friends, then hit the road, heading 104 kilometers east to check the latest weather report from the Mount Washington Summit Observatory. After that, he turned back west, heading towards Franconia Notch Mountain Pass. He parked his car on the east side of the highway, right across from a tough rock formation called Canyon Cliff. From there, just about a kilometer or two ahead, was his destination, the mountain he loved most, Mount Lafayette. Standing 1,600 meters tall, over the years, he'd had plenty of highs and lows on his trails, and in that darkest moment of his life, there was nowhere else he wanted to be. With a small pack of food essentials, just enough to get him to the summit, and his father's old, worn-out ice axe in hand, Guy Waterman set off up the trail around noon. His gear was as weathered as he was, but it didn't matter. This was his mountain. A few hundred meters in, he crossed paths with Marty Sample, who would later recall seeing him for the last time, heading upward with quiet determination. Just around sunset, Guy scribbled the final note and the cards tucked into his pocket. 5 p.m. Summit. He then pressed on to reach an exposed ridge of the mountain. There he planted his father's axe in the snow and braced himself against the brutal winds. The freezing gusts felt like the wing of an airplane slicing through the air, relentless and unforgiving. Guy laid down in front of the axe, his mind heavy with years of pain, loss, and a never-ending search for solitude. And in that moment, with the cold seeping deeper into his bones, it all came to an end, slowly, painfully, and quietly, as he succumbed to hypothermia. That night, the Mount Washington Observatory recorded a bone-chilling temperature of -16 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds were clocked between 110 to 145 kilometers per hour. We can only wonder what went through his mind in those final moments. Was this something he had really thought through? Or was it just another one of those depressive episodes he always insisted he didn't have? The way he chose to die had a lot of people thinking it wasn't something he planned out perfectly. When he didn't come back after 4 days, Laura called in search and rescue teams. A National Guard helicopter was sent out to look for him, but a nasty storm made the search impossible. That's when his close friends decided to step in. They brought a group of experienced rescuers and search dogs up the mountain, and on February 11th, they finally found his body. But instead of giving everything a closure, it just kicked off a whole new chain of controversies. People were quick to point out that while Guy had spent years criticizing how people treated untouched wilderness, he left his own body out in the open on the mountain, a move that totally went against everything he stood for. Then there was his book, Wilderness Ethics, where he wrote, "One has to be sympathetic with public anger about the enormous costs expended in efforts to save people who often have acted foolishly. That such people should pay the costs of rescue efforts seems to us an unarguable point. If you get yourself in trouble, you get yourself out, or you pay." The irony was, a Black Hawk helicopter was sent to search for him, costing taxpayers around $1,500 an hour to operate. On top of that, the chopper hovered over untouched parts of the mountain range, was exactly the kind of thing Guy was always rallying against. On top of everything, Guy and Laura were all about avoiding the media and really valued their privacy. They didn't want the spotlight, but the way he chose to end things, it left Laura in the middle of a media storm with endless interviews and questions pouring in. For a lot of people, especially the Watermans' close friends, the hardest part was knowing what Laura had to go through without him. Back when her knees gave out and Guy started drifting away from hiking because of it, someone asked him how it felt to stay away from the mountains he loved so much. He responded by saying, "I'd rather have Laura without mountains than mountains without Laura." But in the end, he not only left her behind, but also chose the mountains over the women he loved. Nearly 200 people showed up for Guy Waterman's memorial service, way more than could fit in the small congregational church of East Corinth. A little cassette player on the altar played a mix of waltzes Guy had recorded himself. His ashes were scattered in Bara, and as he'd requested, his shoes were buried under the same cairn where he'd once buried Johnny's. After Guy passed, Laura set up a non-profit fund in his name, focused on keeping the spirits of wildness alive and preserving the alpine regions of northeastern North America. The Waterman Fund does this through education, trail work, and research. Laura really embraced the values Guy lived by, and over time, she became just as passionate about those causes. Maybe even more so.